Okay, so I'm going to show you how to mix my version of sourdough bread by hand. And so the first thing that we start out doing is we start out scaling the water. And we need 554 grams of water. And so I'm gonna tear this scale. My water is at 73 degrees, and I want my dough temperature to be 76 degrees when I'm done. And so my water is a little cooler than the final desired dough temperature, only because I'm going to be kneading the dough and adding a little bit of heat in. So I'm gonna scale out 554 grams of water. Perfect. Now, the next ingredient in sourdough bread is a sourdough starter. And so I made my sourdough starter about 12 hours ago. And so it's been growing overnight. And so if you can see the bubbles on the surface of the sourdough starter, and they're starting to get frothy and form little valleys, and that's a perfect sign of ripeness. And this sourdough starter is made from a percentage of 125% water to 100% flour, and then a very, very small amount of existing sourdough starter. So I think that my sourdough starter was about 25 grams of sourdough starter, and then about 300 grams of flour, and then the equivalent, take 300 grams times 1.25 to get the equivalent amount of water. And to check to make sure that your sourdough is ready to use, you want to do what is called a float test. And we'll use the water that we haven't scaled to do the float test. So wet your fingers so that the dough doesn't stick to your fingers. And then you're going to take a little bit of the dough, and it should float on the top. And that's an indication that it's right, because what happens when you're making the sourdough starter is the natural yeasts are fermenting and they're producing carbon dioxide. And so the sourdough starter is filled with carbon dioxide and also alcohol, and it's the carbon dioxide that's causing the dough to float to the top. So that's a sign that your sourdough starter is ready to go. And so we're going to scale out 405 grams, or about 40% of the weight of the flour. And we can just 405 grams. And see how it's floating? That's perfect. That's exactly what you want. Perfect. Okay, so you're going to take your liquid ingredients and you're going to add them to 900 grams of bread flour and 120 grams of rye flour. And this is a stone ground rye flour, and so you can see the speckles of the flour, and I think that that's really beautiful and adds a really beautiful flavor and substance to the bread. So what I do is I sort of combine the two flours, and then I'm gonna make a well, and I'm going to pour the sourdough starter and the water into the center. And then this is my salt, and my salt is, let me just check, it's 23 grams of salt. It's sea salt. I'm going to hold this to the side. We're not going to add the salt right away. What we're going to do is we're going to mix the dough, and then we're going to do what is a process called autolyse, and we're going to let the dough rest for 20 to 30 minutes. And what happens during autolyse is that resting period when salt's not present helps the gluten to form in the bread, and you get better gluten development if you let the dough rest before adding the salt. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort of, like you're making pasta, you're going to start swirling your hand clockwise to bring in all of the dry ingredients. And as I'm swirling it around, at this point, I'm sort of doing some squeezing too, because I really want to incorporate all those dry ingredients. And I have one hand in the dough and one hand is sort of on the outside of the bowl, and I always try to keep my left hand clean. And I'm really going to try to work the dough to really get all of the dry incorporated. And right now it looks like a shaggy mess, but if we keep working it, we can incorporate all of the dry ingredients. And I think at this point I'm just going to get both hands in there to really bring up those dry ingredients. Okay, so I just want to hydrate my flour with the water and the sourdough starter, and that's going to start the autolyse process of hydrating the flour and helping the gluten to form. So now at this point, I'm not going to knead the dough, but I'm going to set it aside, and as I set it aside, I'm going to sprinkle my salt on the top of the dough, and that will help the salt to dissolve, and it will be easier to incorporate. So we're just going to set this aside for 20 to 30 minutes.